If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. I am very honoured to have Ed Miliband with me.
I mean, you're not really honoured. You're not really
honoured. I am hugely honoured. Ed,
I mean,
don't get your snarky little digs in at the outset. I won't allow it.
I'm honoured.
It's great to have you. I'm not going to bother introducing you because if people don't know who you are, it's just a bit odd. We are going to talk about your actually very, very good book. Everyone should read this book. It is actually. It is. It's a great book. It's called Go Big, How to Fix the World. For regular viewers who are confused about this setup, we're actually currently in Somerset in a hotel room 26 minutes before we're supposed to be kicked out. So that's that ticking time.
Do you think they might give you a bit of extra time?
I think we've explained to them that we're interviewing you. So
that might get kicked out earlier though.
I know. We'll see how that one pans out.
You know.
Well, I don't know. I haven't asked their opinions. I haven't asked the receptionist desk's opinions on you. I mean,
why not?
Well, I will on the way out.
No, don't. Okay, don't. Right.
Right. I'm going to ask.
They'll say he was the guy that ate a bacon sandwich once.
Yeah, I mean, you really are the signature bacon sandwich eater of our time. So, Ed, yeah. Just to kick off, so you, of course, were Labour leader, and you have spoken about in this book and elsewhere about how you wish you'd been bolder. And I just found that, interesting because I would say I did whinge about Labour, as I always do, when you were leader, but I always thought you had this vision, you had an analysis, which I thought I agreed with about the market economics being broken, but there wasn't the solutions.
There wasn't the scale of solutions. Yeah,
exactly. What I'm interested in is, I suppose, the why, and I suppose I'm interested because you're what, like I am, Americans called red diaper babies. So both our dads were revolutionary socialists, but you were also a New Labour political advisor. So I'm interested in that kind of what tensions between the Eds, because now you're known as Ed Miliband 2.0, the kind of full fat Ed. And back then, that's not what you were offering, if we're going to be brutally honest. So what I'm wondering is, what kind of stopped you being the Ed with those convictions of your beliefs? Was it a structural thing? Was it within the party? Was it being torn between your political advisor background and your dad's politics? What was the reason?
Probably a combination of all of those, actually. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think, Labour was coming out of government, of having 13 years in government. I stood for the leadership because I wanted to move the party on from New Labour, and I had a certain analysis of the country, inequality, the sort of vested interests that were holding the country back. Some big vested interests in business, and I had a sort of sense that I wanted a more radical offer, and I suppose, well, self-critically, I was good at the analysis, and I think there's a whole, but less good at the boldness of the solutions. I think when you added up my solutions, maybe I still believe that the 2015 manifesto would be much better than what we ended up with the Tories, but it wasn't. I've said before that I didn't have the radicalism that some people wanted, and I didn't have the reassurance other people wanted. I was sort of caught between two stools. I mean, I think there's a whole range of reasons for that. We were coming out of government. I was trying to move the party sort of on from New Labour, and that was a hard thing to do. I wanted the party. I always thought that divided parties never won elections, so I wanted to hold the party together. Fundamentally, I take responsibility. I can't blame anyone else. I take responsibility for not having done it. It's my fault and nobody else's. I think there's also this thing, though, that Milton Friedman, the right-wing economist, said, which is it's the ideas that are lying around that get taken up when there's a crisis. And I think after the financial crisis of 2008, and in a way, this is a kind of important starting point for the book, it was a natural end for a certain settlement, the sort of Thatcherite settlement from the 1970s, 1979 to then. But I'm not sure that the left, I'm not saying there weren't the ideas on the left, but, I think where we are now, there's been a lot more intellectual, political and other work on that on those ideas. So I think we're in a sort of different place, maybe. I mean, that's my best explanation.
As we speak today, Boris Johnson is meeting Viktor Orban, the far-right leader of Hungary, whose regime is anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist. I mean, it's the whole shebang, to be honest with you. Sexist, anti-abortion, very transphobic. They've essentially banned all trans rights in the country. At war with democracy, proudly speaks of a liberal democracy. I've been to Hungary. I've interviewed dissidents there, and in my darker moments, I worry that kind of authoritarian populism, which there are echoes of in our own country, to be honest. It's not as bad as Hungary, but it's kind of more in the direction of Hungary than we should be comfortable with. Poland's another example. You can see Le Pen in France doing very well in the opinion polls. She's the far-right candidate, and there's a presidential election coming up. I mean, do you worry that if the left doesn't offer progressive, inspiring solutions, you've now got a right which actually is quite savvy? They're not the kind of just cut everything like Cameron Hill's done.
Sorry. You're onto something really important, and I say this in the introduction to the book. My reason to go big, to have big solutions to the problems we face, starts from, we've got these massive crises of inequality, of climate change, of recovery from the pandemic, of what the pandemic has exposed. And we need to go big because that's what the moment demands. It's not a sort of political. Doesn't start as a political strategy. But I also happen to think that the only way you defeat the populist right is by showing you've got solutions that meet the challenges of the moment. And the reason I say that is because the populist right, you've seen it with Brexit, you've seen it with Trump, you've seen it with Johnson. They are taking traditional left causes, inequality, or leveling up in Johnson's language, sort of decent jobs, all of those issues. They're taking those issues, the NHS. They're taking those issues and saying, "Well, look, we agree that those are big problems, and it's we who can solve them." Now that tells you something about where. I mean, I actually think this is a cause for optimism in a way, because it shows you where the terrain of politics is being fought. In the 1980s, you weren't born, I don't think, or maybe you're just about born. But in the 1980s, when Labour was out of power, the fight was on the right. The economic battleground was on the right, and I think that is different from now. But I think we can't let the right fill the space. I, as you know, Owen, represent a constituency, Doncaster North, which voted substantially for Brexit. People will often say to me, "Oh, was that all about immigration?" And I say, "Well, look, immigration was one of the issues. The EU was one of the issues, but much deeper than all of that was the number of people who said to me in my constituency, 'I want a new beginning. I want a decent future for my kids. I want a decent future for my grandkids. Where is the industry? Where is the investment?' Now, the point is, we on the left have got to be the people that speak to that agenda. Because if we don't speak to that agenda, pernicious forces are going to speak to that agenda."
I was born in 1984, Ed. Let's just get that clear. I just
got. It was a compliment. It was. I mean, you look like you were born in 2004. I mean, and I mean that in the nicest way. I wish I looked like I was born in 2004.
I've got Tony Blair's portrait in my attic, and anyone who's seen his recent TV appearances can see there is a direct correlation in aging. So, I suppose that Thatcherism, which you just mentioned, Thatcherism itself, this populist kind of narrative, which was the individual will be freed from the dead weight of the state and the suffocating collectivism and so on. That was its kind of offer. And what I'm interested in your book, and it does look at this, is looking at how the left can reclaim freedom and democracy. So, democracy isn't just you go out and vote occasionally, but in terms of your parliaments, but for example, in the workplace, economic democracy. So I'm interested in that. How can the left tell a story, which your book, I think, does, about actually freedom and democracy being central to our vision and narrative?
I think it's really it's a really important point. The way the book thinks about this is, I say, and let me take this into two parts. There was an old social contract, and there was a sort of Thatcherite social contract, very much modified by New Labour. But there was a sort of Thatcherite social contract, which was supposed to be, that was the theory, about setting the individual free and so on. And I sort of think that, actually, when you think about the circumstances we face today, so many people don't have freedom. If you're deeply insecure at work, if all of the risk in society is loaded onto you, if you could be sacked at any moment, if you could be fired and rehired, something that's been sweeping through parts of our economy, if you don't have any savings to fall back on, you certainly don't have freedom. So, and there are just so many different ideas out there that can address these issues. A universal social inheritance, so giving every young person anything up to £10,000 as a platform for the future. More kind of further away, the idea of the universal basic income. I talk about that in the book. Decent social housing, building millions of social homes. That is a way of keep people against freedom. It's about giving people freedom. It's about giving people a base in terms of a roof over their head, a sort of, if you like, a guarantee of that, not being in the insecure private sector, which had all of the problems that has. Creating decent jobs through a Green New Deal, another way of giving people a kind of proper platform on which to stand, are not insecure jobs in the green economy, but secure jobs. So what really strikes me is, and this is what the book is trying to say, is there are so many good ideas out there. Think of it, and I think lots of people get depressed and think, what can we do? You've got Johnson in government. I think what I'm trying to convey to people is a sense of optimism. At least think to yourself, at least see that there are that for any problem we face, there are big solutions out there. And then just briefly on the democracy question, representative democracy on its own is a magical idea, and we've got to defend it. And when it comes to voter ID and all of those things the Tories are bringing in order to disenfranchise people, we've got to defend representative democracy. But in the age we live in, people have higher expectations, and that's a good thing. And there's lots of experiments to draw on here. Citizens' assemblies. I talk about a permanent citizens' assembly on the climate crisis, where you have a representative sample of people kind of advising government, a bit like the expert climate change committee does, on what are the things that we should be doing. A way to give people power, giving young people power over budgets, so that they can work out how money should be spent in our society. Extending votes at 16, that's a way of building representative democracy. Properly devolving power, not in certain parts of the country, not with the centre holding all the power, not saying if you want to do something about the buses, you can't have a municipal bus company because the centre will only give you a permission slip for certain things. So I think these two things that you're mentioning, Owen, which is giving people real freedom and freedom from risk, crucially, because the risk that people have loaded onto them is massive, and kind of revitalizing our democracy and giving power away. I think they're two incredibly important sort of elements, if you like, of what we need to stand for.
So the pandemic has been the biggest emergency, the biggest global crisis since World War II. We can all agree it's been a grim experience, and it's still got a way to run, particularly globally, and we see in the horror in India. And yet, actually, the climate emergency remains a far bigger long-term threat because it's actually existential. Now, we know that if there's a global target to keep global temperature rises below 1.5 centigrade above pre-industrial levels by 2030, otherwise we're in a lot of trouble. Now, a lot of people would think, to be honest, it's too late. We buggered that up badly. We're not going to bring down global emissions to the level we're going to that need. And as a consequence, we're going to have people forced from their homes. We're going to have terrible extreme weather events, droughts, famines. I mean, what do you think? Is it, what are, they're in the book partly, of course, but what are those solutions? Younger people, you've mentioned genuine younger people, not people who just look a bit young, who've been at the forefront of this, and they want action. What would you tell them in terms of what can be done to stop
that we can do it? And don't believe the people who tell you it's about the limits of technology. It's about the limits of imagination and political will. I mean, this idea of the Green New Deal, lots of people talk about it. Why am I a believer in the Green New Deal? Partly, and it relates back to the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s in America, when America was in a terrible depression. And the argument I make in the book, and I think this is really important, Owen, for the way we talk about the climate crisis, is it is about an economic stimulus. We've put forward a plan for an economic stimulus, a green stimulus. You see what Joe Biden is doing in the United States, a $1 trillion plan over the next 10 years to invest in green industries. Now, that is incredibly important, but I want to make a second point about this, which I think is actually the key to unlocking this, which is the insight of the Green New Deal, which is the New Deal in the 1930s was not just about stimulation to the economy. It was also about rebalancing power and creating a fairer and more equal society. And look, here's my case on climate. We will only take people with us, and we will only deserve to take people with us if we don't say, well, we're going to transform our society from the high carbon unjust world to the low carbon and unjust world. In other words, what takes people with us is insulating every home in the country, changing the way it's heated, cutting people's energy bills, creating the green spaces that we know have been so important during this crisis, and which are incredibly unequal in who has access to them and who doesn't. Reorienting our towns and cities around walking and cycling, making the electric cars of the future affordable, improving our public transport system, creating the good jobs at decent wages, with unions playing an important role, social partnership in the green economy of the future. And look, there is work crying out to be done. There's work crying out to be done. But it's not just about a stimulus. It is about a stimulus, and the world is not doing enough, and the Tories aren't doing enough, and all of that. It is also about this incredibly important idea that as we meet the climate challenge, we put economic and social justice at the centre. And let's challenge ourselves, Owen. I think the environmental movement, of which I consider myself a part, have not been good enough at having economic and social justice at the heart of our vision. And those interested in economic and social justice haven't been good enough at having the environment and the climate crisis at the centre of our vision. And on your point about this being the decisive decade, absolutely. We've got to absolutely go for this hell for leather, and we've got to push the Tories to go for it, hell for leather, and push countries around the world. And COP26, the meeting in Glasgow in November, is incredibly important. And we need much, much greater ambition, and we need to push the government for much greater ambition.
It's almost exactly half a decade since the country voted to leave the European Union. A lot of those voters are now, well, the vast majority and the absolute core, obviously, of Boris Johnson's electoral coalition. Some of them used to vote Labour. They're not voting Labour anymore. Your constituency voted very heavily. I think it is actually the most pro-Leave Labour constituency left standing. You can correct me on that. But it's, in any case, a huge number of people voted to leave in your constituency. So on that basis, given your job is partly to speak to lots of people in your constituency who voted to leave, they're not listening, a lot of those people anymore, to not just Labour, just to the left. A lot of them are convinced by Boris Johnson's offer, and they see him as the change candidate. They don't see him as an old-style Conservative at all. So how can the left reconnect with those voters who clearly just stop listening?
Look, the fight is on. The fight is on in relation to that, and that's definitely true. I mean, I think we've been through the most grim experience as a country through the pandemic, and that has totally understandably is the front of everybody's minds, because there's been so much sacrifice and pain and suffering during this period. But then the question is, what do we build after the pandemic? That is the question that occupies me, and that's the question that occupies, in a sense, my book. And I think you had a really important insight in the question, which is people are thinking that Johnson is offering change, and that's the question: who can deliver the change? Now, I do not believe, Owen. I just don't believe that the Tories are going to offer the change my constituency needs. Are they going to deal with the 0 hours contract problems? No, they're not. Are they going to deal with the deep insecurity that is in our economy? No, they're not. Do they believe in the role for government in really investing in the green jobs of the future that I've just been talking about? Not on the evidence that they are showing. Now, if you're saying to me, do we have an absolute fight on our hands to show that we can deliver the change? Completely we do. But I tell you what I'm absolutely convinced about is that that doing the right thing for the country is also the right thing for the Labour Party, in the following sense: that there is a coalition to be built which spans from Doncaster to some of our big cities, which is for the economic change the country needs. We can't, people say, oh, well, you can't unite the kind of, younger, more metropolitan, Labour voter living in a city and the former Labour voters who may have voted Tory at the last election or may have voted for the Brexit Party in places like Doncaster. I don't believe that for a moment. I think the notion that the interests are wildly different, I just literally don't buy it. Young people are really in our cities are really worried about the insecure economy we have. They care about climate change. So do people in my constituency, by the way. But that's the point about the climate vision, is we've got to say to people who are worried about getting to the end of the week, look, this tackling this climate emergency can help tackle that problem too. It's not just about doing the right thing for people and planet, where the big implications are going to be sort of 1, 2, 3 generations hence. So, it's a fight, and politics is a fight, and you certainly don't give up the fight. And I think it's a winnable fight.
Tony Benn, who I believe I think you interned for him, didn't you? You knew him well. He was close to your dad, obviously, and I miss him very much.
My O levels are in his diary.
Of course, God, he was very fond of you, I know. But he always used to say, he said he left Parliament. I can't do it. And that isn't a rubbish impression.
I mean, you really can't.
I'm slighting the memory of Tony Benn. He always did that.
Well, that was really not good.
I do apologise to Tony Benn. I'm sure he'll forgive me. But he said he left Parliament to spend more time in politics. And, one of the things which your book does look at is this idea of change happening not often because of the goodwill and generosity of the power, but because of the struggle of people from below.
Completely right.
So talk about that fight for 15. What are the things that you've learned since you stopped being leader of the Labour Party and you were surrounded by political advisors, some of whom were... Yeah, so go on. Tell us about that. What others can learn from that?
Don't do it, my advisors. It's all I take full responsibility. I had excellent advisors. Now, look. So
no, you didn't.
Let's not argue about that. So look. Here's the thing. If you look, this is some more kind of anecdotal, but when I lost the general election in 2015, I went a few months later to do a course in community organising. A sort of 6-day training course. I'd sort of grown a beard by then in order to hide my identity, which wasn't very successful. But that's sort of the last part of the book is about how we make change happen. And there are, this, and from the work you do, there are so many inspiring people all around this country and all around the world doing this. The fight for $15 minimum wage in the US. Some of your viewers and listeners may know about it. It started off with a few hundred fast food workers in New York City saying $7.25 an hour is not good enough to live on. 22 million people. That is a movement that has now got the minimum wage up to $15 an hour for 22 million people. Joe Biden is at least in theory committed to a $15 federal minimum wage. Whether he gets it through Congress is another matter. What is happening in Preston? Lots of people have written about it, but not just in Preston. The whole community wealth building movement, which is about saying we're not just going to go for the lowest price procurement. We're going to use the power of procurement to pay the living wage, to encourage employee-owned companies, all of those things. That is a sort of a kind of really massive idea, this whole community wealth building movement that we're seeing all around the country. The divestment movement, divesting from fossil fuels, again, it starts on college campuses. And that goes to your point, and the point indeed that I make in my book, which is, part of the progressive condition is getting knocked down and picking yourself up again and recognizing that powerful movements are what fundamentally create change. I mean, politicians, of course, make a difference. The notion that politicians are sort of irrelevant, if Mrs. Thatcher hadn't been elected, things would have been, some of what had happened would have happened, but it would have been very different. But part of the reason for hope is the movements of people. And by the way, business people who are arguing, they're part of this too. Progressive business people who are like organizations like the B Corp, the others who are saying business can't just be about profit. It's got to be about people and planet as well. And, it's hard to take the long view in this. But the National Health Service was, I think, the first conception of it. One of the first conceptions was in the Minority Report in the Poor Law in 1909. Okay, it came to fruition in 1948. LGBT rights. Think about the fight that Stonewall and others had against Section 28 in the 1980s. And okay, we still have a lot to fight for in terms of, against prejudice. But think how far we've come. So I do believe that it is people that, in the end, create the circumstances for change. And by the way, just goes back to my to earlier question. You know, the fact is, and it has taken a lot, but the centre of gravity on political debate around economics has shifted to the left since I was leader in 2010. I mean, it just has. You know, if you think about the field that the Tories are playing on, you know, they've been forced to recognise some of these issues. Now, that doesn't, you know, take away from the pain and the problems of, and massive problems of having a Tory government in power. It's not like it's a consolation prize, but it is reason for hope.
So your book is called Go Big, correct? And you're absolutely right. This is a time we've had the biggest financial crash since the Great Depression. We had the biggest political crisis, as you know, Brexit for however long. We had, of course, now the biggest health crisis for 100 years. And with it,
do you like my Moomins mug, by the way? I'm just admiring my Moomins.
Let's have a shifty. Is it a movement? You need to put it in the camera.
Sorry,
for those who are listening to the podcast, Ed has a very, very fetching Moomins mug. Oh, there they are. Very cool. Very snazzy. Yeah, can see him. Very cheerful fella. Yeah, I think you're using this as a deflection technique.
No, I'm not. I promise you.
Don't you use Moomins to deflect me from a very serious question.
I'm not.
So go big, right?
You're an experienced political interviewer. I'm just a novice, you know.
Yeah, of course, Ed. Just an amateur. Go big, go big. If I was going to sum up Labour's vision today, I wouldn't just say it's go small. I would say it's go very, 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 very small. In fact, so small you can't actually see it. I'm a student of Labour history. I joined the Labour Party aged 15. Not a fashionable thing for a lefty to do back then. Tony Blair was leader. I don't think any Labour leadership has been so bereft of vision or any sense of what it wants to do with political power at any point in the history of the Labour Party since it was founded as the Labour Representation Committee in 1900. So I suppose that's my question to you. No
hyperbole there then.
Well, name a Labour leader who lacked less vision. Don't include Ramsay MacDonald. What's the okay? Let me ask you this. And don't, by the way, on social media, do not mock Ed for this because this is not his fault. What is Labour's vision? Sum it up.
I think Labour's vision. Look, Keir is Keir Starmer is on my book. Labour's vision, I believe, is about the fairer, more equal society, the sustainable society that we need, and it is about transforming this country and the deep inequalities we face. That is absolutely our vision. And you know, look, Keir has faced a uniquely difficult set of circumstances as Labour leader. I mean, I think he's spoken to an audience for the first time in his 14 months as Labour leader in the last sort of 2 weeks. You know, he's come into the pandemic. He's provided opposition, held the government to account, but in a time of national crisis. He himself has said that at the core of his vision is transforming our economy. Transforming the economy we have into the one that we need and that tackles the deep inequalities of our society. And look, as you might expect me to say, Owen, leadership is a collective enterprise, right?
Well,
and it's on me, it's on other members of the shadow cabinet, it's on all of us to show that vision. That's what I'm trying to do, contribute ideas with this book. You know, I hope it helps the debate, not just on some of the issues that we've talked about, on gender equality, father's leave. There's so much to fight for in our country.
So on the pandemic, without getting bogged down in it, but, you know, look, Dominic Cummings, not someone, obviously, who we should be extolling the integrity of, but it was a confession as well as whistleblowing that he did, exposed a catastrophic failure on the part of the government throughout the pandemic, which I do think Labour has terribly failed to hold the government to account, leaving people to conclude, well, the government messed up, but Labour wouldn't have done any better. So that's led to resignation. But I suppose, you know, okay, here's a concrete question, I suppose. I'm interested in what you think about this. Keir Starmer made 10 pledges during the leadership contest. And it's very different. The reason I bring this up is honesty in politics is really, you know, it's hard for a politician to gain honesty as a trait which is accepted, but very easy to lose and never get back. So he made a promise, 10 pledges, increase taxes on the rich, corporation tax, scrap tuition fees, green industrial revolution. He made a series of commitments. Is the leadership still committed to that, do you think?
Yeah, I think we are, but of course you've got to adapt your manifesto in light of circumstances. But you mentioned the Green Industrial Revolution, right? We've been leading the fight that says we need a proper green stimulus in this country. In my area, we need a 30 billion green stimulus, at least a 30 billion green stimulus over the next over the following 18 months, the coming 18 months. To create the green jobs that we need in our society. But the thing I'd say, Owen, is the sort of bigger picture of this is this, which is, look, I was the leader. I know it's a hard job, right? Being leader of the Labour Party, you get all kinds of advice. You've got to be yourself. I mean, you've got to be yourself and go out and argue for what you believe in. And I think we've been in an exceptional period in the last year or more. And we have of course, I recognise that we all have a collective obligation to be bold, to show the boldness that I think the moment demands, and judge. You've got to judge Keir and the rest of us on this, on what follows because of this, because we have been in this exceptional period.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I mean, you've done very well there, I have to say, given the material that you have from the Labour leadership, which is not very good. But I mean, I heard the other day one of your colleagues say, "Oh, we would set out a vision, but the pandemic got in the way." That's not what Clement Attlee said during World War II. He didn't go, "Oh, guys, you know what? Oh, we'd really like to set out this ambitious vision for the country, but there's this bloody war going on." They said, the war shows that we need to be ambitious. When we win the war, we got to win the peace.
I completely agree. I completely agree that the precedent of 1940, no two periods are the same. And the pandemic is obviously different from World War II. But I think at the kernel of the idea, well, for me, what does the pandemic show? It shows who has power and who doesn't in our country. The power to work from home, the power not to work from home. Who gets paid properly? The key workers. So many of our key workers in social care, for example, childcare. Doing some of the most important jobs in our country, paid the least, the most insecure. That's got to change. Our underfunded public services, and if you're asking me, and a whole host of other things too, and the need for green spaces, build back better in terms of green. If you're saying to me, is that at the core of Labour's vision, as far as I'm concerned? Absolutely, it's at the core of Labour's vision. And look, I wouldn't have written this book. I wouldn't be part of the shadow cabinet if I didn't think it was part of Keir's vision as well. As I say, I think you've got to watch this space, and I accept the challenge, which is we've got to show the kind of society we would create, and the next election is going to be a change election, and Johnson is going to be claiming he offers change, and we've got to offer a bigger, better, bolder version of change. And I'm absolutely committed to that, and I know Keir is too.
Well, we'll see. And I will watch this space, which is currently a big empty space, a void even. Anyway, that's me. Sorry, enough mischievous behaviour for me. This is a brilliant book, everyone. I really do recommend it. Ed's, I think, not just, his imagination, his creativity shines through, but also, and I'm not saying this to suck up, but politics does not always attract necessarily the best flavour of human being. Same in the media industry. And Ed's is, I think, very rare in politics in the sense he's, I think, one of the nicest guys I've met in politics, and his humanity shines through in this book. So it's a real honour to have you on the podcast. Everyone go and order now, preferably from an independent bookshop. Go Big, How to Fix Our World by Ed Miliband. It's a great book, and we're very lucky to have had him. So thank you so much, Ed.
Thanks so much for having me on, and I really appreciate it.